My name is Leo Casey. I'm Executive Director of the Albert Schenker Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here today for what promises, I think, to be a very interesting and exciting day filled with a great deal of conversation. The topic that we have chosen is obviously a topic of the moment. It gathered enough interest that, as you all know, we had to move from the AFT's premises to have enough space to accommodate everybody who had registered. So welcome, and we will begin the program now with greetings from the Hillman Foundation.
Good morning, everyone. We are thrilled at every opportunity to bring the Sidney Hillman Foundation out of New York and to DC. As I hope many of you know, the Sidney Hillman Foundation is named after Sidney Hillman, who was the founder and president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, now part of SEIU. And we have year-round programs to honor and foster excellent journalism in service of the common good. And we love to honor and publicize labor stories. For example, yesterday our monthly Sydney winner went to the LA Times for an incredible multimedia investigation about forced, basically slave labor in Mexico, the produce that is coming from Mexico to suppliers like Walmart and then to our kitchen tables where workers are bathing in irrigation ditches is still happening today. I brought some flyers with me that are in the back if you'd like to find out some more details. You may not be aware of this, but most awards contests, think Emmy, Peabody, all cost a lot of money to enter, and you often also have to pay for your trophy and to attend the event. And ours is absolutely free, and we are very proud and happy that we can continue that tradition. There's no fee to enter any of our contests and no fee to attend our event. Our annual Hillman Prize contest is on right now. The deadline is January 30th. Our big award ceremony and reception is May 5th in New York City. I hope many of you might be able to attend. And we are thrilled to be here sponsoring this conference today, and really hope we can figure out together how to move labor's cause forward. Thank you so much.
It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Thomas E. Perez, United States Secretary of Labor. Prior to being sworn in as Secretary of Labor, Mr. Perez was Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice, a division that he had begun his career in many years before as a career federal employee. He was a member of the Montgomery County Council, and he later served as the Secretary of Maryland's Department of Labor, Licensing and Regulation. He was a law professor for 6 years at the University of Maryland School of Law. Join me in greeting Secretary of Labor.
Pleasure to see so many familiar faces, and it's an honor to be here with distinguished leaders and colleagues and friends, people like Randy and others who are stalwarts in the union movement. Leo and I were chatting before. I remember growing up in Buffalo, New York. Hey man, I look around the room, I see friends, and I get distracted. Other leaders in the labor movement, there's so many wonderful people here. And when I was a kid, I would read the New York Times. I grew up in upstate New York, and the thing I remember most was, I think it was the Week in Review section. And every week there would be a column from Albert Shanker. And I have these two cousins who are in their 80s. They're beloved members of our extended family who were New York City school teachers. And when we get together with them, they would regale me with stories of Albert Shanker and what he did. And what I learned from that was it wasn't simply, and it's not unique to Albert Shanker and the movement that he helped build, but it's what I've seen in my interactions as a kid growing up in Buffalo, New York, a labor town. And it's what I see in my job now, and it's what I saw in local and state government, and is that Albert Shanker wasn't simply taking care of his members. He and his members, the UAW and their members, the AFT and their members, the NEA and their members, the AFL and their members are helping to build communities. We're all in this together. And that's what I learned, not only from Albert Shanker, but from all the remarkable interactions I've had the privilege of being a part of. There's one person I really would like to acknowledge that I just saw walking in, and that's Steve Greenhouse. I had a lot of conversations with folks at the Times, and when I learned of your departure, Steve, I mean, you are one of a kind, and we are a lesser media without you, and so I wanted to acknowledge you personally and say thank you, and I hope you will continue to be part of the discussion because your voice is so important. You know, the next Tuesday is the State of the Union, and as we prepare for this, the State of the Union is really an appropriate time for reflection, where we were, where we've come, and where we need to go. And I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets to tell you that the president's going to talk about, you know, where we've been, where we've come, and where we need to go. You know, the 3 months before the president took office, we lost 2 million jobs in the United States. 2 million in simply the 3 months before. You now look and fast forward to 2014, 3 million jobs roughly were created. You look at even beyond that, we've had 58 consecutive months of private sector job growth, which is the longest streak in history, to the tune of roughly 11 million jobs. Last year was the best year for job growth since 1999. And last year we saw the biggest average drop in the unemployment rate since 1984. And what we're seeing, especially in the last year, is that the growth was very, very broad-based. The construction sector last month alone added 48,000 jobs. And these are good middle-class jobs. And so America's coming back. And the president's going to talk about that. And we have a lot to be proud of. We dug out of the worst recession of our lifetime. But we undeniably have unfinished business. And the president's going to talk about that unfinished business. And last week, we were together with our friends at the AFL and so many others to talk about the unfinished business of wage stagnation. And the challenge that we have, and the difference between 1999 and now, is that the growth that we were seeing in the late 90s resulted in greater shared prosperity. And the challenge for us moving forward is to build an economy that works for everybody. Bless you. And bless all of you for that matter. I don't want to single anyone out. It's not simply to build an economy that lifts some boats, but to build an economy that lifts all boats. And that's the unfinished business. And as much as we are making progress, I continue to meet folks who are still working to find that job. I meet other folks who haven't gotten a raise in years. And as you know, and people like Steve have reported on it, this phenomenon is not simply a product of the Great Recession. This is a decades-long trend. And this conference couldn't be more timely, because the conversation about how we build an economy that works for everyone requires us to have a level of introspection and a tough conversation with ourselves about what do we need to do. And there are many things that the president will be talking about next week, and you've heard him talk about it before: minimum wage and transportation infrastructure, immigration, and all those issues that are absolutely, positively critically important to growing an economy that works for everyone. I want to focus on the issue that I think is really the centerpiece of today's conversation, and that is the issue of worker voice. Because I know that when you look at the history of America and the growth of the middle class, it didn't simply coincide by some fluke, but it was inextricably intertwined with a labor movement that was strong. And as a result, productivity and real wages went up side by side. There was a social compact across America. We are all in this together. There was the rejection of false choices. We don't either take care of our workers or take care of our shareholders. We do both. We create a virtuous cycle when we're all in this together. And over the last 30 years, productivity has continued to rise. The American workers are as ingenious and hardworking as ever, but real wages, as you know, haven't kept pace. And the issue of worker voice, as we move forward to have the conversation about how do we build an economy that works for everyone, is, I think, a centerpiece of what we need to discuss. And I think about where we were as a nation back in the early mid-20th century. We had a really great attachment to many institutions. People belonged to the Elks Club or the Eagles Club or the church, the labor hall, the bowling alley, the bowling club. Now we moved to today, and we see a lot of folks who are bowling alone. And the question presented is, how do we build a movement when some of these structures have evolved? And when the order of the day for so many millennials is, I'm on my gadget. And how do we build sustainable structures? And how do we acknowledge the headwinds? And the headwinds are undeniably formidable. State legislatures who are doing away unfairly and ill-advisedly, in my judgment, with collective bargaining. Hostile courts undeniably taking aim at the right to organize. Forces with great money who wake up every day. There was one person whose name slips my mind, although you know him well, who said, I wake up every day trying to figure out how to screw unions. That is not a paraphrase. That is a quote. And we have some in Congress who want to make sure that worker voice is limited. And the thing about it is I come to you with an unbridled sense of optimism because these voices and these headwinds are not new to America. You look back 100 years ago or so, and you had the Lochner decision. You had a hostile court who basically said laissez-faire, unbridled economics is the law of the land, even if it results in unsafe workplaces and people who don't get fair wages. We had what FDR called calamity howlers, who said, if we enact a minimum wage, it will be the end of the world as we know it. There was a wonderful movement that I found it very interesting. I think it was 1892, a really interesting movement where there was an effort to establish an 8-hour day for workers on federal contracts. Sound familiar? And there was a monthly trade journal, Manufacturer and Builder, that called this, quote, about as vicious a piece of demagoguery that could be conceived. So, they didn't tweet it out back then, but these headwinds we have seen before. And we have always had the wind at our back and assets that we bring to bear. And that's what I see in this audience. Because I will tell you, one asset that we have is President Obama. He understands that change comes from the bottom up. He understands that the labor movement and American prosperity went hand in hand. He understands that we need to be deft and we need to figure out other ways to expand and ensure worker voice in America. And so that's a huge asset that we have. And I love my job in no small measure because I know this president gets it. And he understands that it's a false choice to suggest, as I said before, that we either take care of our workers or we take care of our shareholders or we take care of our customers. We went to the Ford Motor Company last week together because that's the story of labor and management working together. Ford and so many others in the big three had an existential crisis in the Great Recession. And what did they do? They worked together under a plan of shared sacrifice leading to shared prosperity, rejecting those false choices. And now you look at, for instance, the data on folks who work in unions. The average union member, the median income is about $200 more than a non-union member, and that doesn't include benefits. And we'll have more data in a couple weeks on that. The annual survey comes out the end of January every year. It's consistently shown that when you are able to work collectively, people benefit, and not at the expense of employers, in partnership with employers. So we have many assets. It starts out with President Obama. It continues with the various forces in this room and the ingenuity that you have brought to bear. People, not only leaders like Randy and Rich Trumka and our friends at SEIU and others, but it's also the emerging leaders from worker centers who have figured out other ways to give voice to workers. And they have done so with such incredible deftness and success. And I am so glad that the MacArthur Foundation so acknowledged one such leader most recently. The Gupta family, by the way, as an aside, I just met the youngest member of the family. I just hired one of the other members of the family, and I want to meet the parents. Because do they have a slacker child? I haven't met one yet. And that's what gives me optimism about tomorrow, because we're seeing all of these emerging models. And by the way, what I also see in my conversations and travels is there are so many employers, large, small, and mid-size, who understand this as well. This is not an us against them strategy or an us against them challenge. I see so many employers who recognize that their workers are their most important asset, and that giving voice to workers not only helps workers, but it helps communities, and it leads to that virtuous cycle. So we may have many assets there as well. And that is why I leave you with, if you can remember one and only one thing, we're having this same conversation. There is undeniable headwinds, but make sure we understand history. I think Randy was a history teacher and taught, and she understands a little bit about law as well. And when you look at history, the arc of the moral universe bends toward those who seek to expand opportunity. The Lochner Court didn't become the law of the land. It was taken over because we came together as a nation. We're not celebrating George Wallace Day next week. We're celebrating Martin Luther King Day next week, because America understands that the arc of the moral universe bends not only toward justice, but toward people who seek to expand opportunity, create win-win scenarios, build virtuous cycles. And undeniably, we have work ahead of us. But we had work ahead of us 100 years ago, and we came forward in partnership. We had work ahead of us during the Great Depression, and we came forward, and we moved forward, and we moved ahead and built a virtuous cycle. We have headwinds now, and I have no doubt, based on the people in this room, based on the president of this nation, based on virtuous business leaders that I meet every day, based on incredibly intelligent and strategic labor leaders that I work with regularity, faith leaders and others, I have no doubt that the arc of the moral universe will continue to bend, but we know it will not bend on its own. And that's why today is so important. And I hope, Steve, that you can brainstorm with us now that you're no longer employed by the New York Times, because we need to tell our stories as well and understand that there is a big machine out there that is working to tell a different story, to muzzle worker voice. And we need to counteract that, because that is a key to our success. So thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. I wish I could be here all day because this is a conversation about the future of the middle class, how we build an economy of shared prosperity, how we get back to a truly virtuous cycle where rising tides indeed lift all boats. I am confident that we are on our way there, but I am confident that we have significant unfinished business, and under your leadership and with the spirit of Albert Shanker and Hillman's and other union leaders and other trade unionists in this room, we will succeed. Thank you for having me.
It is now my pleasure to introduce for our keynote today my leader and my friend, Randy Weingarten. We've known each other for close to 30 years when we first met, saving our inner city high school from asbestos contamination by the Department of Education. And in those years since then, Randy has gone on to assume leadership of the American Federation of Teachers, representing workers in education from pre-K and daycare through K-12 to higher education, in healthcare, and in local, state, and federal government. Prior to becoming the president of the AFT, she served for 12 years as the head of the largest union local in the United States, the United Federation of Teachers, where she also worked as the head of the Municipal Labor Committee, negotiating health care coverage for all of New York City's public sector unions. So without any further ado, let me give you Randy Weingarten.
What Leo didn't say was that I think that both of our favorite jobs was teaching, and Leo was an amazing mentor to me in terms of my learning how to teach high school students. But the enduring notion that with the kind of effort and resources, all kids can succeed, and our inner city kids at Clara Barton High School would repeatedly go on to either win or place or show in constitutional debates all throughout America. And that, if that doesn't give you an enduring sense of what you can do when kids really are engaged, nothing does. So thank you, Leo, for having the kind of patience with me as a new teacher, and for the kind of work that you've done both in classrooms as well as here in the AFT leading the Shanker Institute. Thank you very, very much. I also want to, look, we told the secretary that we were doing this, and you can see his, his instinct about wanting to help us mobilize in new and different ways. And I'm so grateful that he was here with us for a bit. And I'm also really, really grateful to the American Prospect and the Hillman Foundation for co-sponsoring this with us, and for all of you being here, because as this says, we need to learn a lot. And so we have a lot of panels here. Teferi is with us from the AFL-CIO, and we also have, as the secretary said, one of the Gupta sisters, and we also have other kinds of models of organizing, like Sarah Horowitz in terms of the freelancers. And so we have a lot of people here who can help give us a lot of food for thought, because that's where we are, and that's what we need to do if we really believe in the kind of collective action that our movement is about. So let me start by saying, the secretary said this too, our history in the United States is pretty rich in terms of the fight back. We fight back against inequality, we fight for justice and opportunity, we fight, and have fought to create the New Deal, the Great Society, equal rights for women, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, all of that, as most in this room know, was won with the critical support of the American labor movement. I'd add public education as well. But think about it. Today, our movement is at a crossroads. Globalization, technical or technological changes, and technical changes, and all the other changes, diminished union density, and a view, frankly, that we are an antiquated brand, and an aggressive, well-funded campaign, legislatively and judicially, by anti-union forces to break our infrastructure. Right to work, paycheck deception, Harris v. Quinn, Fredericks versus CTA. I don't frankly have to tell those in this audience the many challenges our movement faces. You know it and see it and feel it every day. But at the same time, as the Secretary also just said, workers need a voice more than ever. Decades of wage stagnation, rising economic inequality, shrinking middle class, devastating student debt, dwindling retirement security, jobs that are constantly shifting, contingent labor being the norm, not the exception, collective bargaining being the exception, not the norm. The first generation that's doing worse than their parents, working families feeling squeezed, 1 out of every 2 students in public education being poor. Every single one of the workers and children in this society need a voice. They need us, and we need them. So the question becomes, how can we revitalize the American labor movement to face these challenges, be the voice that working people want, and the robust engine that our economy needs? Are we flexible enough, forward-thinking enough to meet the demands of the 21st century economy and the 21st century workforce? Can our infrastructure, the labor movement's infrastructure, adopt and adapt to meet the needs of a new generation and new generations? And make no mistake, this is on us. It's our responsibility. Sure, we've faced assaults from the Walmarts and the Koch brothers and the Alex and the Scott Walkers and the Sam Alitos and the hedge funders. They all understand the potential power, the promise of American labor, which is why they do what they do, to try to kill us. But we can't simply focus on what they have done. We must focus on what we should do. We can't lose sight of the power of a movement of labor, of the solidarity of working folks. We've retooled before. As, the secretary outed me as a high school teacher. And so forgive me for a minute. Look at the 1920s. The ranks of the American labor movement were decimated at that time. Unbridled corporate power was skyrocketing. Totalitarian states had destroyed, in the United States, I'm not talking about internationally, had destroyed independent labor movements that had developed here in a nascent way, as well as that had developed abroad. But rather than accepting its fate at that time, the American labor movement at that time, lots of different ways, not with Twitter, not with Facebook, not with email, but we developed a vision and a strategy for renewal that would lead, as you all know, we all talk about it, in 2 decades to our height when 1 out of 3 workers were in the American labor movement. When confronted with a new era of American capitalism dominated by mass industries like auto and steel, American unions developed a model of industrial unionism that revived and reinvigorated the labor movement and made it a force for decades of social, economic, and political reforms. That force that we talk about all the time as the one behind the curtain, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, on and on and on. And today, as we face a new global economy, one centered much less on industry and much more on knowledge, we must again develop a new model of unionism for the 21st century. And it may not be monolithic, it may be a lot of different models, but all aligned. We are in the technology era, moving at the speed of light. We can't operate any longer like we're in a factory. The knowledge era is here. And as circumstances change, as our nation changes, as our world changes, we must change too. Now, I'm sure a few of you are thinking, because this always happens when I raise these kind of issues, okay, if we abandon industrial unionism, we're waving the white flag. Please. Have you ever known me to wave the white flag? We will never surrender our values. But at the same time, we can't conflate industrial unionism with the labor movement itself. Our strategies and our tactics are different than our values. We believe that the labor movement should provide a collective voice to working people, and that means organizing. We believe that to provide a collective voice, the labor movement has to foster solidarity and democracy in our ranks, promoting member activism. We believe that the labor movement should organize for economic justice, political power, and dignity for all working people. We believe that the labor movement should organize for social justice, seeking dignity for all rather than prosperity for a few. That's not anything, that's something that probably everybody in this room could say, because everybody in this room feels. But when you believe in economic and education justice and opportunity, when you believe in democracy, in voting rights and social justice, then what that also does is it leads you not simply to fight, but to work to ensure that all communities have access to quality public services, which is part of the reason we do a lot of the work that the Secretary referred to. So these enduring values are not just values that underlie the UIW, the AFL-CIU, SEIU. These are values that underlie us at the AFT. And these are values that I think can help us think about a new paradigm of unionism. And so let me just briefly talk about the four kind of pillars that have been ours in terms of thinking about that new unionism. Number one is our engagement with community. Number two is our focus on the quality of public services our members provide. Number three is our internal organizing and member mobilization. And number four is our external organizing of the unorganized. I'll talk about all these very briefly and then I'll go off the stage. On community engagement, as our nation, our pendulum has constantly swung from individualism to collectivism and back again. I know collectivism is not the word anybody uses anymore, but think about what Hillary Clinton said. It takes a village. That's collectivism. Over the past decades, the idea of collective voice and action has been undermined in the name of innovation, disruption, globalization. And that's led to more working families feeling squeezed, even after they've worked hard and played by the rules. But I do believe that the pendulum is swinging back, or starting to swing back. It's starting to swing back, and you do see this notion of it takes a village again, this notion of collectivism. You see this in the Fight for 15, in the Wisconsin State House, with Occupy, with the movement after Ferguson, with this incredible show of solidarity this week in France. But these are streaks of activism, moments of engagement. They are not movements. The impulse for unity, the impulse for peace, the impulse for democracy, for liberty, for the ladder of economic and education opportunity, it's there. We see it, we feel it. It's not just what you've seen in Paris this week or in the Arab Spring. You see it on Twitter every nanosecond. People do want to come together. So our challenge collectively, and that's part of this conference today, is how do we work together to build new movements build a new vision for collective action. So in our judgment, that means that community must become the new density of American unionism. We can no longer focus, as industrial unionism did, exclusively on the workplace, or rely on our own density to set market standards, raise wages, or improve conditions. Today, public education, between the NEA and the AFT, has the greatest union density of any major sector of the American economy. But for us, a singular focus on the four walls of the schoolhouse does not work. We need a new approach, one that builds power through partnership with community. And that's what many of our locals and our national is doing and are doing. We're trying to build organic relationships with community, relationships that are not transactional, but a real two-way street. And we're working to rethink how we re-engage community in everything we do. Later, Mary Catherine Ricker, the AFT's executive vice president, will describe how her local in St. Paul, Minnesota, made community into active participants in the negotiation for a collective bargaining agreement. You all know this in terms of the success of the strike in Chicago. They made it about nurses and guidance counselors and what community needed, not about wages and benefits. The Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, and on and on and on. Second, solution-driven unionism. The AFT is a public service union, as Leo just said, with members in education, healthcare, and local government. From austerity to privatization, we find ourselves on the front lines of these battles daily, ensuring the quality of the services we provide is key, not only to fending off these attacks, but to also providing the ladder of educational opportunity, the ladder of economic opportunity. Quality can no longer be the province of management, as it was within the framework of industrial unionization. Then, you remember this, unions negotiated wages, working conditions, and due process. Not that that is wrong. Those are absolutely vital to have a middle class, to have voice. But the employer alone decided how to organize and deliver goods and services. And with that employer's prerogative, the employer also limited the voices and the ideas of those closest to the work. So part of what we're doing in terms of the ambit of professionalism is we're trying to secure a voice for our members in the important decisions of their workplace, be it a school or a hospital, a daycare center, a government office, or a university, knowing full well that when our members have that kind of voice and agency, they will not only make the work better, they'll not only have more satisfaction in the work, but ultimately the people we serve will be served better because of their voice. A virtuous circle. So take New York City. This last contract, the UFT negotiated prose schools in which school staffs can adopt educational innovations that waive Department of Education in New York City or contractual regulations with a supermajority of about 65%. Real teacher voice in their school's education direction. Flexibility in exchange of voice so that there is a real expression and direction very different than the industrial style of unionism. So that's what we call solution-driven unionism. I make up the name. It came from ABC School District, where labor management collaboration is a reality. And it's rooted in solving problems, not winning arguments. It's about building the power we need to negotiate as real partners. It takes power to stand up for our values. It takes power to find common ground. It takes power to fight back and to fight forward. It's a both and that's how you move forward. So even as we're under attack, as budgets are cut, as services are privatized, we're focused on an agenda of advancing a proactive quality agenda that will help all students succeed. And you hear that from us all the time when we talk about we're reclaiming the promise of public education so that we can invest and have strong neighborhood public schools that are safe, collaborative, and welcoming environments for students, for parents, for educators, for the broader community. We have an agenda that talks about how schools and school staffs have to be well prepared for the job that they are about to do. They have to be well supported. They have to have manageable class sizes and time to collaborate. But they also have to have rigorous standards that focus and are aligned on engaging curriculum, that focus on teaching and learning, not on testing, that include art and music, civics and sciences, where all kids' instructional needs are met. And before somebody starts saying, as I go through this list, oh, this is a pipe dream, every school that does this in the United States has turned around and has done well for kids. And for every school that somebody can show me that's failing, I will show them a school like this. We can do this, but it does require having a voice and also a responsibility to take on and to solve problems and to find common ground. Member mobilization. A union and its members are stronger when we know that we are together. Remember that old ditty, union is us? A union is its members, and it's strongest when its members are active and engaged. When our adversaries are trying to divide members from their union, an active membership provides a needed counterweight. Look in Michigan, in the face of the new right-to-work law and concerted anti-union campaigns that encourage this kind of free riding, or basically breaking our infrastructure, the AFT successfully signed up 92% of our workers in our collective bargaining units. ASME talks about how they had a goal of 50,000, and they're up to, Lee tells me, 130,000 in terms of even more than that, as Paul just says. But to fully engage our members, we can't just be service providers, a model that defined industrial unionism. The relationship between a union and its members can't be transactional or contractual. It has to be transformational. It has to be a real movement. And we have to adopt an organizing model that focuses on activating and empowering members through collective action. And the model can go beyond workplace actions and job actions. It's far harder to marginalize the pre-K teacher on the front lines talking about why she needs paid sick leave, something the president's going to talk about today, or the ER nurse explaining why she needs the best training to provide the best services. And that empowerment becomes catalytic in terms of the life of a local union when you get there. So membership activism and mobilization is particularly important with the millennial generation. On the whole, millennials are more politically progressive and open to collective action, more insistent that their voice be included in important workplace decisions. Vast income inequality and work and college debt, crippling college debt, are their norm, and they want to change it. And even though we can be, the American labor movement can be the change agent, as adjuncts and graduate students see, they need to be actively won over by the labor movement and our unions. And to do this, we have to engage them in ways that reflect their preferred modes of communication, small informal gatherings, and digitally through social media. Social media has extraordinary organizing potential, and the labor movement needs to adapt them in our work. Some of you know that I am not just an evangelist for social media and organizing amongst millennials. While I still believe real, not virtual contact is best, I do my best to walk that social media walk, spending an inordinate amount of time, everyone in my life reminds me, communicating with AFT members on Twitter and Facebook. I think it's important for our membership activism, for mobilization in the AFT, that its national union president be accessible to her rank and file, and the presence and my presence on social media, even though I, like almost anybody else, don't like the invective that is hurled, that makes it possible. It starts creating that trust and that engagement. Last piece. Every worker deserves a voice. And so new organizing becomes essential not only for those currently in unions, but also for the welfare of all working people. At the AFT, new organizing has allowed us to grow our membership. I actually very rarely say this anymore, because we've grown during this period of time when teacher unions and public sector unions and private sector unionism has been under serious and terrible assault. Jessica Smith will talk about much of that in a little while, so I don't want to actually talk about it now. She will talk about a lot of that. But that's what a lot of you are going to talk about later on today, too. Traditional workplace organizing along the lines of industrial unionism is not the best fit for the current landscape of American work and the American worker. Does it sometimes still work? Of course, but we need to be broader. And while we at the AFT have had some success using different approaches in different contexts, we are still in the early stages of this experimental work and are just beginning to draw lessons from it, from our own work, and from the work of so many people who are about to speak this morning and this afternoon. Many of us are trying to confront these new realities so we can help workers and their families fulfill the same goals and aspirations we had when we joined the American labor movement. The renewal of our movement is no small undertaking. We can't be glib about the challenges before us or claim quick, easy victories that fool ourselves and that fool others that transformation is not needed. We must figure out how old and new power come together to be real power. Workers need it. Our members need it. Working families need it. We know from our history, we know from the power we see every day about working people coming together and speaking out that renewal can take place. We know that the enduring values of the American labor movement provide a strong foundation for renewed American unionism that will give collective voice to working people in the 21st century global knowledge economy. We know that the building blocks of a renewed American labor movement are to be found within this room, in the new thinking, the new organizing, the new strategies that have developed not only in our ranks, but in all of your ranks. That's why this conference became totally and completely oversubscribed, and we had to move it. We know that the critical process is drawing upon this new thinking, this new organizing, these new strategies can help us build something just like in the 1920s, where we actually do what we need to do to help people pave the highway to a better, a fairer American dream. Thank you very much.
So while the first panel is making its way up, I'm going to explain a little bit about the theory of the day. This is an awfully crowded day. There's a lot going on. But the cost both to you and to us would be too prohibitive to do a multi-day conference. So the theory of the day is actually that we're going to have an ongoing conversation, and that you shouldn't expect that every question raised in the first panel will be addressed there. The panels will proceed with each speaker giving a a presentation. And then in each panel, we've reserved about 40% of the time for exchanges with the audience. Given the size of the audiences, we're going to take down questions on index cards that also allow us to identify questions that a lot of people have and make sure that they're asked. There will be 15-minute breaks after each panel, so people have a chance to get up and move around. We're providing you lunch, so people won't have to go out and look for where they can get food to eat. And we're also going to do a reception at the end of the day, so folks have a chance to gather around and do stuff. So if our first panel would come up. The other thing, for those of you who are speakers, we stole in a little bit from soccer. Your chair will give you a yellow card with 2 minutes left. And then when time's up, you'll get a red card. Yep. And I will let the panel chairs know when they're running out of their time. What?
I'll give it to them
At 2 minutes. And when they're done.
so each have 12 minutes. Did you have that?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Harold wants to start on this one. The other
I
order is
think
fine.
he's going to start assisting.
Okay, so Tiffany.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we're going to begin. Teferi, you're going to go first.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And that was, I thought, a great setup by the great Randy Weingarten to set us up. So you have to pardon me. I'm still playing the new card, and I'm going to play it for a little while. So I come from the local labor movement, and I'm still struggling to adjust to the culture and attitudes and the smartness of DC. DC and entirely the corridor now in this area. So, look, our core mission at the labor movement is, at the end of the day, to build organizations for workers, so that workers can exercise their power to better their own lives. That has been the role of the labor movement for generations, but as our country and our society and the global economy changes, so must we. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Do we need to adjust, or do we need to throw the baby with the bathwater? I think that's what the crossroad is. I think that's where we are at. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and how someone with a funny accent and the way I look end up here. I got my first union job working at UPS. And I didn't go looking for the union found me. I got a night shift job as a part-time worker. I'm used to working liquor stores and unorganized places. And the first opportunity I got to work in a union, and the union rep coming and talking to me and giving me a union card and telling me what time I take my break and my responsibilities to be a productive worker and how I represent and I have a role in being the best at that workplace, because whatever I do reflects back to all of us what makes the union at that workplace. Even though I went to graduate school, I never ever left the labor movement ever since then, because that's what I wanted to do. I saw the power of being empowered by knowing that you have other workers at your workplace who look after you, and you're not on your own. And that fundamental value, we can't, we shouldn't, we could not ascertain actually of abandoning, leaving, or throwing away. Because without that, we don't have a movement. Now, we have a lot of things that are ailing us. Randy talked about the organized attack that comes at us. The organized attack that comes at us. Sometimes people tell me, you know, how come the gay lesbian movement is actually proceeding a lot faster than the labor movement is, and change is happening. Even on immigration, even on everything else. But I'll tell you, corporations and the ruling class, even if they don't like it, it's easier for them to adjust on something that doesn't cost them anything. We are sitting at the table and saying we want our fair share. They're never, ever, ever going to give you that because you have a good slogan. They're going to give you that because you're going to fight for it. And it's not fighting for it from an intellectual perspective, but fighting for it by bringing workers together and allowing workers to decide what's best for them. What's best for them. So let me go back to my adjustment I'm trying to have in DC and the intellectual class in DC. We try to position ourselves a lot to be an agent for workers without including workers at the table. I am not giving up. I'm never going to give up, and we should never give up on the actual rank and file workers having a space to fight for themselves. We should facilitate that, but we should never take that away from them. And I think that's what the intellectual class tries to do, not from coming from evil, but I think it is sort of giving up. Workers don't have the power to do these things, so I'm going to negotiate for them. Yes, we should raise minimum wages. Yes, I'll walk and I'll fight to raise the minimum wage. But I want to fight, I want to walk for the minimum wage with other workers who will gain from the minimum wage. I don't want to do a backroom deal of persuading elected officials or whoever to raise the minimum wage without workers actually lifting a finger for it. Because that's not allowing you to build a movement. In order to build a movement, we need to always keep the workers at the center of our thinking and value them for what they do. It doesn't happen in this town just only on workers. It happens on immigration. It happens on everything else. We have a lot of people from the bottom of their heart, good people who want to fight for immigrant rights, but they don't think of sitting down with immigrants themselves and saying, I want to empower you to go fight for yourself. So, in Orange County, look, people say, California, you do a lot of things because California is a set place. I'll invite anybody who wants to do work to go to Orange County and see if Orange County is not anything but California. So let me give you one example, what we did with the Teamsters. In 1999, the Teamsters tried to organize sanitation workers in Anaheim, California. These are people, not the trash collectors, but after all your trash goes in, these are people who lined on the sides of a belt and with their hands go through trash to look for recyclables. Just imagine what you throw into your black garbage bin. From roadkill to syringes. That's what they do. So when they tried to organize them, the company immediately called ICE, and most of them got deported. That has a huge chilling effect for people. And the union didn't go back. So Ron Herrera, with the president of that local, always brags in Orange County we have a huge union density. And one day when we're visiting the site, I saw these people coming and going from the site. And asked them, are they your members? He said, no, they're not. And he told me about what happened in 1999. Here is where we need to focus on our community. From the network of about 50 churches we work with and community organizations we work with, in our next meeting, I brought this up and I said, if we're not fighting for these people, who are we fighting for? What is the purpose of our existence as a movement? So we turned part of the organizing over to the community. And we used the community to put pressure. And all we asked them was, go back to the company and ask them to sign on a piece of paper. They're not going to call eyes on their workers anymore if they try to organize. When that happened, we started working with the Teamsters. And long story short, within 7 months, 700, it's not a lot of people, people's mind, 700 sanitation workers today have a collective bargaining. They get 2-week vacation. They have health care. They get a limited amount of gloves. That, to me, is what the labor movement needs to live for and need to survive for. And these people just don't have a base. They have a collective bargaining. They sat across the table from their employer and got what rightfully was theirs. So we need to change course on a lot of things. But we need to use the infrastructure of centuries, decades and decades of infrastructure that the labor movement has built. I don't think we should be ready to abandon it and to throw it out. At the end of the day, we are the only thing left between what would happen in this country, even worse than what's happening. That's why, like Randy said, they come after us. You take us out of the game, you take the movement out of the game, you take the entire progress movement out of the game. They're not dummies. They know that. So how do we move forward? How do we move forward? Randy was also right. I come from California. We have won defensive fight after defensive fight after defensive fight. If we can defeat 3 practically consecutive paycheck deception initiatives with hundreds of millions of dollars being spent, I think we have it within us if we actually reprogram ourselves and go on the offensive and take things from the other side, we can actually win. So I have 2 minutes left. And in that 2 minutes, I want to give you just a few examples. This is not, by the way, in any way to say the course we're traveling is right and we should stay. But I want to give you examples of actually organizers as we speak today who are going and talking to unions, workers to sign up into a union and signing up and winning. Signing up into a union and winning. So, more than 12,000 workers at the merged US Air and American Airlines who did not have a union before have joined CWA. Just this past year. Just this week, 20,000 flight attendants at Delta have filed to have a union election. Still work's being done and work's happening. Graduate teaching assistants at New York University, at the University of Connecticut, just joined UAW and now have collective bargaining. Car wash workers in Los Angeles and New York organized in partnership with community organizations to join the steelworkers and RWDSU. Bike share workers in New York, Boston, Washington, Chicago have voted to join TWU. Manufacturing engineers are coming together, partnering with Lane. I know someone from Lane is going to be presenting later on, are changing the way procurement works, and through that process creating a venue for workers to have a collective bargaining agreement and confront their employers at the workplace. TV writers in reality shows in New York have recently joined the Writers Guild East. So a lot is happening. We can do a lot more. That's why we're working with our community organizations and community workers. I see Christina here, that there's nothing more I value than the organizations that Christina leads and Casa de Maryland and all the vibrant worker centers that are popping up all over the place. But at the end of the day, my message today, right or wrong, is we need to be considerate of workers, and we need to empower workers to decide for themselves, even though we need intellectuals, but the intellectuals themselves don't create a movement. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Harold Meyerson from the American Prospect. And this is a coterie of my mother's friends who are applauding there. So on behalf of the Prospect, which worked with the Albert Shanker Institute and Hillman putting this event together, thank you very much. Particular thanks to Leo Casey for all the good work he and his folks did putting all of this together. I will add that, as was not the case until about 3 minutes ago, there are now copies of the American Prospect back on the table there. We are this year celebrating our 25th anniversary, which is not as much as the New Republic, which just celebrated its 100th, but then you know what happened to the New Republic. And I also want to introduce my leader, perhaps America's most distinguished social democrat and editor of the Prospect, Robert Kuttner, who is here today. And the Prospect has a proud heritage of taking young college graduates, actually paying them to be our writing fellows, and later today, one of those folks, Rachel Cohen, will moderate a panel and be the youngest person up here today. So the Prospect last summer sent me to Seattle to write about the minimum wage victory there. And after knocking around Seattle for a couple of days, I realized that really was not the story. The story was, as we all know, how difficult it is to organize workers and get a collective bargaining contract in this day and age, and what that spilled over to, which was quite remarkable in Seattle. What I found out was that in the town of SeaTac, which is where the airport is, the Fight for 15, a brilliant, brilliant campaign, had been trying to organize workers at the airport, service workers. There weren't that many of them, a few thousand. And the airport authority and the ghostly presence, really, that controls the airport, Alaska Airlines, said no. And so you'll hear today from two folks, one on this panel, David Rolfe, one on a later panel, Sejal Parikh, who heads Working Washington, the Fight for 15 in Washington. Decided sort of to call the airport's bluff, and they put a ballot measure on the SeaTac ballot in November 2013 that really said immediately wages in SeaTac are going to go up to $15 an hour. And, you know, really this was just a way to try to get Alaska Airlines and the airport to the table. I mean, confronted with this, why wouldn't you negotiate for a few thousand workers? But in the time-honored tradition of American employers in this day and age, they didn't. Lo and behold, the measure passed, and it helped inspire the very good fast food campaign in the much larger neighboring city of Seattle, and 100,000 workers became subject to a process by which their minimum wage will be raised to $15 an hour. So it was easier, yeah. This was hard as hell and required all kinds of the kind of four cushion shots that are required these days to win victories for workers, but it was still easier than organizing a few thousand workers at the airport. Get a raise for 100,000 workers, a significant raise, or organize a few thousand workers at the airport. And this said to me that we really need to look at all the panoply, all the range of campaigns that are going on now, assess them, look at strategies, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and that's what Leo and I were hoping for when we discussed initially this conference. Today, there are victories for workers going on in campaigns initiated by unions and proto-unions. There are minimum wage hikes in a whole range of cities and states. There are paid sick days in an increasing number of jurisdictions, and of course the president is going to argue for this in his forthcoming State of the Union address. There is an organization of domestic workers that has now won Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights in 4 states. In San Francisco, they have just enacted the Retail Workers' Bill of Rights, which requires employers to give their workers 2 weeks' notice, 2 weeks advance notice on what their schedule will be, so that their workers can actually plan their lives. What a radical concept that is, and I don't see why there aren't a hell of a lot of other cities that shouldn't be adopting this in the forthcoming months. Taxi workers in New York are getting favorable rulings from the taxi commissions, but, none of the things I have just alluded to have resulted in collective bargaining agreements. You know, you could say, okay, yeah, but the legislation is great. Well, the legislation is great, but in every case, the campaign for it has been waged by organizations backed up by actual existing unions. So this is the catch-22. Unless we can increase the number and power of worker organizations that have the clout and the ability to sustain themselves, we will ultimately not even be able to win that which we've been able to win in the legislative arena. Nonetheless, as we look at where the workforce is headed, and particularly at the rise of contingent work, you do have to question what is the best model for a workforce in which more and more workers are not actually officially listed as employees. A cautionary note, there was just a piece in the Financial Times earlier this week about Japan, noting that Japan actually has a very low unemployment rate, but that wages in Japan, as in most of Europe and in the United States, have been absolutely flat despite a condition of high employment. Now, I mean, this gets to the conundrum of, well, if unemployment falls, if employment rises, wages will eventually rise. Well, I mean, the short answer to that is no, they won't. We're seeing this in Japan, we are seeing this here. Wages do not rise as the tide comes in. They will not rise ultimately unless workers have a seat at the table and a demonstration outside the door. So what we are seeing in the current period of American labor is kind of a not conscious drift, I think, towards something a little more like the Knights of Labor than the AFL in the late 19th century. The Knights of Labor were a mid-late 19th century collective organization that welcomed members and played no special emphasis on getting them contracts in their workplace. And they were the organization at that time that was demonstrating for the 8-hour day, and they rose in a sort of parallel historic continuum along with the AFL, which did focus on workplace organizing and got contracts. Now, the problem for the Knights, although they were in many ways far more progressive than the early AFL in the 19th century, the problem with the Knights was that when they hit a political rough stretch, as they did after Haymarket in Chicago, and when they hit the depression of the 1890s, they couldn't sustain themselves. They vanished. They're gone. Which gets us, I think, to focus on the fact that we are currently winning in certain cities, in blue cities. Most cities are blue. In certain states, most cities are red, but even red states, as you know, this November voted to raise the minimum wage. South Dakota, Nebraska, Alaska, Arkansas, that you can't sustain these victories and you can't do more unless you have a workers' organization behind it. And so the purpose of today is to hear from a range of folks such as Karen Nussbaum and David Rolfe, who are actively engaged in figuring out what kind of workers' organizations we can build today, what kind of new strategies, what kind of new organizational forms are relevant. There is still, as Tafari absolutely accurately noted, there is still some good, what we might call conventional organizing going on, but really today no organizing is conventional in the sense in which Randy was alluding to in the organizing campaigns of the 30s and 40s. We're seeing HERE, Unite Here, continues to grow. Although this is partly related to the power Unite Here has in particular cities, with city governments helping them out, and the power they have in some hotels that are already unionized, that are owned by the same folks who have hotels that are not unionized. We are seeing things like the campaign spearheaded by the IBEW and the LA Alliance for a New Economy, Lane, which just got a union neutrality agreement at a new factory that will be built to build rail cars for the LA metro system, hopefully better than the ones in the DC metro system. And the key component here was the purchasing power of the LA Transit District, which wanted a local facility that had union representation, the presence of the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, in working this deal out. So organizing can require political pressure, and it can require all kinds of new strategies. And you'll hear some of them today. You'll hear from Rich Kallenberg about should labor organizing become a protected right under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, for which violating that has much more serious consequences than violating the National Labor Relations Act. You'll hear about the kind of union arrangement that the UAW is working out with Volkswagen in Chattanooga, and about the possibility of members-only unionism, something that Tom Gagan has written about in his new book, and that Catherine Fisk, law professor at UC Irvine, has written about and we'll talk about today. And the whole conundrum, which none of us have figured out very well, of a workforce which has a huge number of independent contractors, of contingent workers, of workers who work full-time and are mysteriously labeled temporary workers. I've seen this in the warehouses outside Los Angeles, where they ship the goods that come in at the ports of LA and Long Beach, where 40% of the imports come in, and this is there are 270 temporary employment agencies in this area. You can work there forever. You can have a different employer every week. The state of California is beginning to push back on this. You're going to hear a lot of this stuff. It is not hard to poke holes in many of these new strategies. If one of them clearly worked, we wouldn't need to have this discussion. Sejal Parikh from Working Washington has a piece on the Prospect website. We have already put up 4 articles from people participating in this panel on the American Prospect website, www.prospect.org. We will put up more, and along with the Shanker Institute, we will also put up a video of the day's proceedings. And Sejal Parikh, discussing one campaign, wrote, "We haven't yet found the right model for workers' organizations." Well, that's true. That's why we need to have this discussion today. We hope today's conference advances that discussion and accelerates the process by which we find the model or those models that will help us build a just and better America. Thank you.
Good morning, and thanks to Harold for inviting me, and to Randy and all the folks at the affiliated organizations for putting on this exciting event. I'm David Rolfe. I'm the president of SEIU 775, the home care and nursing home union in Washington State and Montana. In a previous life, I ran the Los Angeles home care organizing campaign for SEIU in the 1990s. I'm a vice president of SEIU, and I'm the founder and chair of the Workers Lab, which I want to talk about momentarily. But I think we should start with a little bit of context. The net assets built by the American middle class since 1940 are gone. The net economic impact of women doubling their workforce participation from 1977 to 2012 has been $0 in take-home pay for the bottom 90% of income-earning families. Our nation is in the midst of a 40-year hourly wage freeze, or if you're in the bottom 50% of income earners, a decline. And, the net assets held by Latino and African American families are so thin that many are literally 1 or 2 paychecks from personal bankruptcy. The American middle class is no longer the largest one in the world. Depending on your measure, we may be down to number 17. And everyone in this room certainly knows the inverse relationship between union density and the percentage of American income that goes to the top 10% and top 1%. Once you stop talking about deceptive averages that include income and wealth for the top 1% and start talking about medians, the picture and the points on any graph you could construct, whether you're talking about income, whether you're talking about wealth, whether you're talking about intergenerational social mobility, all paint an incredibly depressing picture of what is happening to work and workers in America. This is not a phenomenon that began with the Great Recession. It's a phenomenon that began, I would assert, roughly with the publication of the Lewis Powell memo, and what you could blame Ronald Reagan or the doctrine of shareholder value maximization that developed in the business schools in the 1980s. Pick your villain. It is an incredibly frightening picture, and it doesn't get any better. There is no pendulum programmed to swing back automatically by some law of physics. If you look at the jobs that are growing right now, we've essentially replaced all of the middle-class jobs lost during the recession with poverty wage jobs. And the preponderance of new jobs are those that make under $30,000 a year, under $15 an hour. 15 of the fastest 20 occupational categories are in jobs that pay less than $15 an hour. 17 of the top 20 fastest growing occupational categories are in jobs that don't require any more than a high school education or perhaps some professional training on the job. So the myth of this sort of jobs gap, if you just get yourself educated enough, somehow there'll be a wonderful old school job with a high wage and good benefits, simply not true. And more and more, I think 50 million is the number I heard of Americans who are now in something that looks like non-standard, non-traditional full-time employment, contract, contingent, eDesk, Olance, Amazon Turk, Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, TaskRabbit types of work where people have to cobble together many of these things to put together a relatively low income unless you have an asset like a Manhattan apartment or a town car that you can make somewhat more money on. And if all of that is scary, it's not going to do anything but accelerate, right? Unless Moore's law stops the pace of technological change. Right now we laugh at home care robots in Japan that take 90 seconds to fold a towel, but in 12 years, if technological capacity increases every 18 to 24 months, they will be able to fold more towels than any home care worker or hospital worker or hospitality worker could. So we have not only a really frightening and depressing current state of work and workers in America, we have even more acceleration of these trends to come. And if we think that there is some secret room in the government or in some place that we somehow don't know about, where a group of people other than us has a secret plan to rescue the American dream, you go through life and you do certain things. I spent 20 years organizing workers, get called into union leadership, and at some point you realize that you know all these U.S. senators and governors and cabinet secretaries, and if there were such a room, you think you would know about it. And then you realize it doesn't exist. If there is a master plan to rescue the American middle class, that somehow someone in the administration or corporate America, Wall Street, whoever, is withholding from all of us until it gets bad enough, we should disabuse ourselves of that notion. And, I want to say to sort of Harold's article, which, hard for me not to love. I came out looking pretty good in it. But I think there is there is this, right? I don't think the old model's coming back. Many of us in the labor movement have been waiting for that mythical pendulum to swing back since sometime in the 1980s. We are essentially a movement in our current set of institutions that have passed our strategic inflection point, didn't catch it in real time, whether you could debate whether that was the Taft-Hartley Act or PATCO or any of a number of events in between, or, you know, the fourth time we failed to reform labor law with Democratic supermajorities over the last 40 or 50 years. But the next time we have that big of a supermajority, there will even be fewer states with any senators incentivized to deliver for a union base. New York now has less union density than Tennessee had in 1983. Seattle has less than New Orleans had in that year. Both Tennessee and Louisiana now are about at 2.4% in the private sector. So what is to be done is you know, the perennial question. And you know, later you get to have the sort of Sajal, my friend and colleague, will be able to talk more specifically about the Seattle and CTAC campaigns that we led and how we managed to construct, really by accident in many ways, political atmosphere and environment through direct worker action and mobilization that resulted in sort of the conditions and the tables being set for, you know, literally bargaining. I mean, I was sitting across the table from the guy who owns the Space Needle, the Sheraton Hotel, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the head of the Hotel and Restaurant Associations, literally bargaining a $15 wage plan with the business leadership of a city. And we have yet to figure out how to transform that into sustainable organization, although we are trying. But if our version of sustainable organization relies on change in federal labor law, if it relies on a set of conditions that were present roughly in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but are not present in today's economy or today's politics, then we are probably guilty of, you know, the attributed to Einstein definition of insanity and doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. And when you actually look at the budgets, which are the true mission statements of labor organizations, we do essentially the same 5 things that we have been doing every year since we peaked in our density in 1958. We mainly represent workers through existing collective bargaining contracts, the care and feeding of union members, and contract administration and bargaining, and all that stuff. That's mostly what we do. We pay for the expensive internal bureaucracy and democracy that we have. Some of us still organize workers into this sort of declining bargaining model, and then we spend a lot of money electing Democrats and then begging them to do what they said they were going to do. And those are essentially the 5 things the labor movement does, and about 99% of its budget. And what, you know, when you look at our own history, there have been moments of crisis before. My friend Dorian Warren found this article from 1930 that said, it was in the New York Times, Steve, it said, oh, you know, we went looking for the labor movement. We couldn't find them. They're not really around here anymore. We you know, went to headquarters, knocked on the door. The Secretary-Treasurer was gone. He had been there for days. There was a stack of mail. We don't think these guys, no one showed up at the annual parade. The labor movement isn't going to be heard from again. And that was in 1930. But what John O. Lewis and everyone, I think at that moment, figured out, not unlike what Louis Gershner did at IBM, Steve Jobs when he came back to Apple, or Andy Grove at Intel, it was sensed the strategic inflection point as it was happening and reallocated talent and resources on a massive scale from an old model to a new one. Now, industrial unionism was not brand new in the early 1930s. It had been around for some number of decades. It was distinctly the minority viewpoint in the American labor movement at the time. It had a sort of distinctly radical and foreign reputation, but it existed, and it was the other game in town that, faced with the collapse of sort of labor's ability to keep people out of the labor market within an era of 25% unemployment, that essentially people, the leaders then said, okay, it's more important for us to take all of our best organizers and all of our resources and invest in a completely new model. Today, we do not yet know what that new model is. So while we collect $12 billion a year in revenue and own $36 billion in assets, not including all of our benefit funds and the like, just in treasuries and real estate and the like, we don't yet know what new model to transfer those assets and resources to. And this, I would argue, is one of the causes of our time. The moment is not right for wishing the old model would come back. It is not the right moment to pretend that whether it was Taft-Hartley or Ronald Reagan or PATCO or NAFTA or pick your demon, never happened. The moment is right for risk and experimentation. The moment is right for people criticize me when I say learning from Silicon Valley, but they figured out something right about rapid cycle prototyping, failing forward, and learning. Right? Actually being proud of your failures because you have an opportunity to then design the next version and make it even better. And so that's what we want to do at the Workers Lab, is essentially to incentivize organizers, activists, entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, technologists, anyone to experiment with and prototype new models that meet three critical criteria: the power to change workers' lives for the better, the scale to ultimately touch tens of millions of Americans, and a revenue model, and we as lefty organizers cannot be indifferent to this, that actually gives organizations the ability to live and fight another day, even in periods of bad economies or political disfavor. Those are the three essential elements of the DNA of the industrial union model that Lewis and others invented when they transfer their resources and assets from old organizations to new ones. So this is, I believe, the thing we must now do. I'm told I'm very much running out of time, so I will wrap up by saying this. Except in rooms like this, no one remembers the names of labor leaders from 100 years ago. Most Americans at one point to pass high school civics had to remember that Woodrow Wilson was our president 100 years ago. But most people could not name a US senator or a governor, a CEO, a popular entertainer, the most popular author. No one knows any of that. Most of us can't really remember exactly who all was in our family tree going back then. What I said a lot during the Seattle debate on 15 minimum wage, but I think applies equally to this ethic of risk-taking and experimentation in our movement right now, is that 100 years from now, no one's going to know who any of us were. They will remember President Obama. They will not remember the name of anyone else in this room. But people remember movements, and they remember great moments of social change. We remember abolition. We remember, for good or for bad, temperance. We remember suffrage. We remember civil rights. We remember Stonewall. Right? We will remember immigrant rights and marriage equality. So 100 years from now, what people will remember is not any of us as leaders, not any of the institutions that we lead. They will remember whether, when the American dream was at her greatest level of risk, a handful of brave people had the courage to stand up and do something about it. And that's absolutely what I think we all need to commit to doing. So thank you.
Let me offer my thanks to the hosts of this exciting conference as well, and the wonderful array of speakers talking about new strategies. I'm Karen Nussbaum, the Director of Working America, the community affiliate of the AFL-CIO. And to acknowledge, first off, that a lot of the most exciting new strategies are coming directly out of the traditional labor movement, from AFT, UFCW, SEIU, UAW, CWA, steelworkers, and that's just the beginning. There's a breadth of experience we're going to hear from today, but I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my experience, where I've come from. I'm one of the early adopters of the notion that you build movement and institution at the same time. I was part of starting 9 to 5, the Organization for Women Office Workers, a million years ago or so. And we were incredibly successful we engaged tens of thousands of women who'd never been involved in anything before, and we touched millions. And for institutional power, while we had this open-facing, anyone can join organization 9 to 5, we also created institutional power in a union, District 9 to 5, which was part of SEIU. Now, our timing was perfect on the movement building side. We complete with getting our own major motion picture, 9 to 5, and the timeless workers anthem, the 9 to 5 song by Dolly Parton. But unfortunately, the timing was a little off on the institution building side. We started our union in 1975, completely concurrent with the newest form of union busting that was just emerging. And we were a really big cost center for a lot of those union busters. But nonetheless, we have built a union that prevails today and understands both the challenges but the power of collective bargaining. Working America, as I said, the community affiliate of the FL-CIO, I sometimes think of it as 9 to 5 with men and resources. It is also an open door to all, to any worker who doesn't have a union. It's an open door to enter the labor movement, to be part of what we're doing to fight for good jobs and a just economy. But it's the only door in some ways, certainly the only door on scale, for a part of the working class that really doesn't otherwise get touched by the progressive movement, and that's white working class, particularly moderates out there in suburbs, particularly who are easily peeled off by a right-wing social agenda and increasingly by libertarianism, but who would be with us if we went and found them. And certainly that's the experience of Working America, which today has more than 3 million members, largely those white working class moderates, all of whom don't have a union on the job. We're successful around politics and policy and being strong in our community, and now we're turning that capacity, that institutional capital, let's say, to the dilemma and the challenge of creating new forms of worker representation and organizing. We're doing that a lot, and I just want to outline a little bit about what we're doing. We're doing that a lot with affiliates, so we use our field capacity, our ability to go out into the field every single night and talk to folks in partnership with AFSCME around their really exciting campaign to reorganize the organized among their home health care workers. With UFCW around our Walmart, when we go door to door in neighborhoods, we encounter lots of retail workers, including, as it turns out, depending on the community, hundreds over the course of a month or so, who are former and current Walmart associates or other kinds of retail workers. We recently worked with the local labor movement in Ames, Iowa, to knock on every door in a big part of Ames and find out where everybody works. Well, that's a pretty awesome wealth of information that's really hard to come by in other ways. And we're an incubator for unions as they try new forms of organizing, like the Iron Workers, which created the Iron Workers Associates, which is a committee of Working America, and they've used it as a way to reach out to unorganized iron workers, help them take militant action on the job, and then raise standards in those workplaces and then move them into standard membership. But we're also a laboratory for change for other kinds of strategies. And as we're trying now to find what are the sustainable forms of organizing, whether it's among licensed workers, whether it's among big groups of workers like retail outside of big workplaces, or citywide formations that encompass all kinds of workers, to build organizations with dues-paying members who have a vote. And as we look at building those organizations, we also have 3 concerns, and they're a little bit different than David's, and that's what makes for a good discussion, I think. And so what we're looking at is the key challenges for us is, first of all, the importance of changing minds. That the issue fights that we're having today on minimum wage or paid sick days are necessary, they're thrilling, they're creating tremendous momentum, but they don't necessarily change your worldview. And I certainly saw that when I was out campaigning in DuPage County, right outside of Chicago, going door to door in this recent election, where at every door I knocked, everyone was for raising the minimum wage, while they were also saying that they were going to vote for Bruce Rauner, who was probably the most anti-worker candidate in this last election cycle, who did become governor of Illinois. I'm going to get a glass of water. Thank you very much. So we need those fights for all the reasons I mentioned, but we also need to create a viewpoint so that we're not going back and fighting over the issue fight over and over and over again. A viewpoint that basically says that Wall Street and big corporations fundamentally have different interests than working people, and that the way you and that it's the strength and numbers of working people that are the countervailing force, the only, in some ways, countervailing force to that kind of power. Now, pollsters call that a frame. I think in the olden days we might have called that class consciousness. But that's what workers need to have in order to, so that when they wake up every morning, that's what they bring to what they're reading in the newspaper or hearing on the news or experiencing on the job. And so that changing minds, creating that, I think is essential to building the kind of sustained new forms of organizing that we're talking about. Secondly, structure and scale. And David and I certainly agree on a lot of this. And I won't belabor it. Many of us have talked here about the change from trade unions to industrial unions in the 30s, and I know as a young organizer at SEIU, we organized wall to wall, that the importance was don't just organize those clerical workers, organize everybody in the workplace, and that's the way we'll have the greatest power. But as the workforce has changed, and we find people with huge turnovers in these workplaces, and you work not for the direct employer, but it's welcome precariat, that we need to change the model. And in fact, today we may have more to learn from trade union organizing than we do from industrial organizations. And there's a lot more to say about that, and I won't right now in the interest of time. But that it also, as we do that, we have to look at how we're going to bring that to scale, which starts with militants taking militant action, but has to be supported by other dues-paying supporters. And that leads me to my last point, and that is the importance of dues and democracy. That we need revenue, but it has to be, I believe, conscious decisions to pay dues to support your organization because it's your organization. Workers need to pay for their own organizations, and for a variety of reasons, including my first point, which is consciousness. But they also have to have a vote. And that democracy can be a hot mess, right? And it doesn't always get you where you want to go, but that's a challenge that we've got to take on. We have to build a workers' movement, and that redistributes wealth and power. That our object here is not just to redistribute wealth, but to redistribute wealth and power. And the only way we do that, I believe, is if workers own their organizations through their dues and their vote. One last word, and that is whether the new forms and old forms are in conflict. Collective bargaining unions are investing millions of dollars and time and strategy into new forms, as they and we should. And as others, including Randy this morning, talked about 100 years ago, the AFL, the trade unions, and the organization of those trade unions was in peril. The CIO and industrial organizing wasn't a threat to trade unions, even though it probably felt like it was. In fact, the success of the CIO was the salvation of trade unions. Because of the adapting to a new form of the workplace and the workforce, union membership skyrocketed, and it was the increase in union density and the success of a workers' movement that then created the undergirding of the trade union form of organizing as well as new industrial organizing, so that collective bargaining as a whole thrived. The new forms of representation we are experimenting with today don't deliver the power of collective bargaining, but they may be the only way to both redistribute wealth and power and preserve the power of collective bargaining unions as we go into the future. Thank you.
Okay. We have some questions from the audience. Dave, I believe this would be geared primarily to you. How will the end of agency fees affect locals like 775?
So we should, one of my lawyers is in the room who will probably send me glares if I say something I'm not supposed to here. But listen, I think, the Australian trade union movement had to struggle with this in the 90s when they lost worksite access, agency fee, dues deduction, all on the same day under the Howard government. And they suffered, I would say, a debilitating crisis in the short term, and arguably perhaps emerged stronger in the long term, as they had to, in many ways, re-earn the love and loyalty of members that, in some ways leadership had taken for granted after, sort of a 100-year tradition of labor functioning so much of the part of the government that all you had to do was put on a union name badge and you could walk into any work site and inspect the safety conditions and the like. So, I think that, the record so far is mixed. When you look at what's happened, you can look at Wisconsin, look at Michigan, look at home care in Ohio, and in many cases, there's a pretty scary and depressing results. You also look, I think, at what both AFSCME and SEIU have done, in light of Harris v. Quinn. Membership levels are incredibly high and actually have gone up since the decision, not down. So, I think that most people in the world, let's be, agency fee is not the norm in most of the globe, right? It's not. And, most labor movements figure out how they actually speak for all of the workers while collecting dues from a minority of the workers. And that's not our model. It's not the model we was before 1950 or so. It was, even Louis Brandeis, who was, very pro-labor, actually questioned whether it was the right political decision for unions to pursue the agency shop. Listen, I'd say we would keep it if we could. We have this particular Supreme Court, which gave us Bush v. Gore and Citizens United to thank for what happened in Harris, what will quite possibly happen in Friedrich. And, I think we have to be willing to stand up and say no court is going to stop workers from building power. And if there's anything that I'd say, it reminds us that now is a time for risk and experimentation and trying to build new models. It's that whether we like it or not, some of the tools associated with those old models are going away. How'd I do? All right.
Here's another question. In a lot of industries, white union leaders and white union members are trying to preserve what they've gained and view unorganized Black and Latino workers as their enemies. How to overcome this? Anyone?
Well, the Black and Latino members can vote out if the union has any shred of democracy. I have seen this in the hotel workers in Los Angeles. I've seen it in lots of other unions. The answer is if you're discriminated against in your union, you get angry, you organize opposition, and you go from there. And if you have a legal case, you file a legal case.
Are there any examples of successful minority union models?
Well, the most exciting one that I assume we'll hear more about later today is UAW in Chattanooga, which essentially is a minority union that is bargaining with management and is a path, I believe, probably shortly to majority status. But I think it's one of the exciting innovations that we're seeing within the traditional trade union movement, and that will, it's not without its perils, but I believe it'll probably be discussed more this afternoon as well.
Okay, and the final question I have is about militancy. and a need for militants, and how can and should we focus our energies on finding and creating more militants? How central is militancy to your organization's thinking, and how do new forms of organizing foster more militancy?
I'll take that. I think others may have something to say about it. I guess the way I'd answer that may also relate to the last question as well. I mean, ultimately, you know, we spend a lot of time thinking about policy, whether that's embedded in an employment contract or in a law or in regulations. And those of us on the left, I mean, really do like to think about what should the law be, or what should the contract say, or what should, you know, what's right. And, you know, we have to accept, I think, that policy is merely frozen power. And when your power starts to melt, the policy, whether it's contractual, legal, political, that when you no longer have that level of power, then the policies that you depend on go away, and you can't pass the new ones that you like. Power, in turn, only really comes from disruption. And then what happens is that you disrupt the status quo. At some point, it accommodates. New seats are somehow found to fit at the table. That everyone swore there were no new seats available, and somehow some new seats show up, and then you get a chance to be one of the parties to some sort of, whether it's political, contractual, whatever, bargain. And that is as true of an effective contract fight as it was about how we got the labor law we have to begin with. So the question for the 21st century, it seems, is what is the new disruptive force that can replace the forgotten art of the industrial strike in an economy where that is no longer particularly powerful? And I don't think we know what that is, but that has to be our North Star in our quest to find the new thing. And in Seattle, it was militancy by fast food workers who closed down a bunch of restaurants, captured the hearts and minds of a city, right, in this very tight timeline. This wasn't even anyone's master plan. We just kind of did it. Convinced people who had never thought about a $15 minimum wage that it was totally normal to be for a $15 minimum wage. No one even polled on the question until after the campaign was done, when we discovered that, in fact, 75% of the public supported it. But I think that came from disruptive activity on the part of workers.
And I agree, but I think that also we need to make sure that we need militant action, we need that inspiration, but leaders need to have followers, and you can't have a vanguard that's so far out in front that isn't backed up by both organization and an ever-widening base of support. So, for example, during Occupy Wall Street, Working America, which goes out and talks to, in these working class neighborhoods, talks to folk on their doorsteps every single night, we went out to talk to them about Occupy Wall Street. And while the first reaction from most people is, I don't even know where I'm not going to go sleep in a park. That was not where any of our members were, their heads were at. But it required engaging in a discussion about, what do we mean by income inequality? Because it's still actually a pretty abstract phrase for most of our members, so that you can't take a mass base for granted. You have to organize a mass base, and you can't do it just one by one, but you can't do it just by inspiration.
All right, one last question for you, Karen. If class consciousness is one of the measures of the progress we seek, what are the observable metrics for it, and what is your experience in Working America with increasing it?
Well, I'll tell you, it's a fair question, really, and we pay a lot of attention not just to what we say when we're in neighborhoods, but what we hear. I'm embarrassed almost to say we call this the information accordion. That we're putting information out, we're getting information back. We've had 8 million conversations in these working class neighborhoods over the last 10 years, and so we got a lot of data. But one of the things that we've noticed is that over that decade, fewer and fewer people have any direct experience or even notion with the idea of collective power. That as union density has declined, this connection to the idea about strength in numbers, which is what we talk about at every single door, is evanescent. It's more and more distant. and that is a foundational problem. We have to find the ways that we reintroduce the saliency of the notion of collective power. And again, I think that is some combination of brick by brick and inspiration. That we need to be going to find, we have to go interrupt the people who are not looking for us, interrupt their normal paths of conclusions about how their lives work, and move them in a different direction. So that's one measure that we experience. Another measure is the 2014 elections. We just talked about how people could, vote for minimum wage and Bruce Rauner, or vote to defeat the anti-worker ballot initiative in Anchorage, Alaska, while they were voting against Mark Begich, who was supporting them. Progressive economic populism does not necessarily translate anymore. There's a rupture between that and progressive politics. So I'd say we're kind of like rock bottom right now when it comes to class consciousness. It's changed because of the roiling that's going on around, whether it's fast food or Fight for 15 and our Walmart. Those things are extremely powerful, and they help to shift, but it's got to be much more ideological than just that, and we have to take that on. And in Working America, we are taking it on, and we're actually going to we're going to measure it. We're going to find the measurements over the next several years to really challenge ourselves about whether we're doing it right.
Great. And closing thought from Harold.
My friend Guy Molyneux, who is leading labor pollster at the Peter Hart firm, put out a memo to Democratic candidates sometime before the 2014 election saying, I know you all, ritually invoke the middle class in your comments, but our polling suggests that the number of Americans identifying themselves as middle class in recent years has fallen from 40% to 25%. So that is a shift in a kind of class consciousness. People are aware that they're getting screwed and that their kids are not going to have as good a life as they. It does not follow from that, as Karen says, that they have any notion of the possibilities of collective action, that they think of that they really target the right targets. A lot of people still blame minorities and others for their lot. But that has, but there is certainly, as obvious as the sun rising in the east, an awareness that most people's economic prospects are either stuck or declining, and it's up to us to figure out, as everyone here is trying to do, how best to deal with that and turn the situation of unconsciousness about the possibilities of collective action, how to turn that around.
Thank you, everyone.